"Sir, these documents don't look legitimate to me. I'm going to need to verify these before I can process anything." The clerk said it loudly enough that the row of people waiting on plastic chairs nearby looked up from their phones. Marcus Delaney stood at the counter of the Fairview County DMV with his 7-year-old son Bryce beside him, having waited 40 minutes for his number to be called, just to renew his license and register the used truck he had bought the week before. He had brought his registration paperwork, his current license, proof of insurance, and a bill of sale. Everything the website's checklist had specified, and none of it had mattered from the moment the clerk, a woman named Sheila Prentice, looked at his work clothes, glanced at the bill of sale for a truck priced considerably below what she apparently expected, and decided, before examining a single document closely, exactly what kind of customer she was dealing with. Bryce, sensing something shift in the air even before he looked up from his handheld game, glanced toward his father with the same quiet watchfulness he brought to most unfamiliar situations. "I've seen plenty of altered bills of sale come through here," Sheila said, sliding the paperwork back across the counter without stamping anything. "I'm going to need to call the seller directly before I process this registration." What happened over the next 20 minutes would end with Sheila standing behind her own counter with no explanation left to give. A fellow veteran in line recognizing Marcus's face from a firefight that had defined the worst night of his own military career, and everyone within earshot learning exactly who they had just watched get accused of forgery over a truck he had paid for in full. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe, because there's more coming. Marcus Delaney had spent 10 years in the Army, the last 6 of those as a Special Forces weapons sergeant attached to a team whose deployments took him into some of the most demanding operational environments the military assigned to that particular specialty, work that required not just tactical skill, but the kind of sustained composure under fire that most people never had reason to test in themselves, let alone rely on to keep an entire team alive when things went wrong. He had raised Bryce largely alone since his wife's death in a car accident 3 years earlier, an absence that had reshaped nearly everything about how Marcus approached the ordinary, unglamorous work of getting through each day. And he had left active duty 2 years after her death, unable to reconcile the deployment schedule with a son who needed him present in a way that had never been true before. He was 37, compact, and powerfully built in the specific way of someone whose training had never fully faded even years into civilian life, with a quiet, watchful stillness that people sometimes mistook for detachment rather than the habit of constant situational awareness it actually was. He had entered the Special Forces pipeline after 4 years as a regular infantryman, drawn to the additional training by a combination of genuine interest in the specialized skill set and a restlessness that had made conventional assignments feel insufficient for the particular kind of challenge he was looking for. A restlessness that, in hindsight, he sometimes wondered whether fatherhood had simply redirected, rather than fully resolved. The selection process had been the hardest thing he had ever done physically and psychologically, washing out the majority of his original cohort through a deliberately engineered combination of exhaustion, isolation, and decision-making tests designed to reveal exactly who could function correctly when every resource had been stripped away. He had loved the work that followed, with an intensity he rarely tried to explain to people outside that world. The particular clarity that came from operating in environments where every decision carried immediate and tangible weight, nothing abstract or deferred about any of it. He worked now as a project supervisor for a regional construction firm, a job that used a fraction of his actual training, but paid steadily enough to give Bryce the stability Marcus had decided mattered more than any career ambition he might otherwise have pursued, a decision he had made without hesitation and had never once regretted, even on the days when the work itself felt considerably less meaningful than what he had left behind. He did not talk about the specifics of his deployments unless directly asked, partly because the details did not translate easily into casual conversation, and partly because he had learned that most people's curiosity about his service rarely extended past a surface-level fascination that did not require him to relive anything genuinely difficult in the answering, a distinction he had come to value more the further he got from active service. He kept his old unit patches and a handful of photographs in a box in the garage, rarely examined, but never discarded, alongside mementos from a chapter of his life that felt, most days, like it belonged to a different person entirely, though certain smells or sounds could still, unexpectedly, pull him halfway back into it, without warning. Their apartment carried the particular quiet order of a household, run by a man determined to give his son as much stability as he could manage on his own. A wall calendar in the kitchen, tracking Bryce's school schedule alongside Marcus's work rotations. A small shelf in Bryce's room, holding a photograph of his mother that Marcus made a point of discussing honestly whenever Bryce asked about her. He coached Bryce's youth basketball team in the winter, mostly because nobody else had volunteered, and Bryce had asked with an earnestness impossible to refuse, and he had spent the past week finalizing the purchase of a used truck from a private seller, a good, honest deal that had taken considerable research and patience to find within his budget, requiring him to make this particular trip to the DMV to complete the registration before he could legally drive it. Bryce was a quiet, watchful child, in the way of kids raised largely by a father who modeled careful attention as the default response to most situations, and he had come along to the DMV mostly because school had a teacher planning day that Friday, and there was nowhere else for him to be. He had brought a handheld game to occupy himself during what he expected to be a boring but uneventful errand, settling into the plastic chair beside his father, with the patient resignation of a child accustomed to occasionally tagging along for adult tasks that held no interest for him whatsoever, at least until the tone of the conversation at the counter shifted into something he could sense, even without fully understanding. He had grown accustomed, over the past 3 years, to reading the subtle shifts in his father's demeanor that signaled when something was actually wrong versus merely inconvenient, a skill most children his age had not yet needed to develop. They had taken a number upon arrival and waited the better part of 40 minutes before finally being called to Sheila Prentice's window. Marcus laying out his documents in the organized, methodical way he approached most administrative tasks: license, proof of insurance, the bill of sale from the truck's previous owner, and the completed registration form he had printed and filled out at home the night before, double-checking every field against the DMV's own published checklist to make sure nothing was missing. Sheila reviewed the documents with an attention that seemed, at first, entirely routine, until she reached the bill of sale, and something in her posture shifted. A recalibration Marcus recognized immediately, because he had encountered similar moments in contexts that had nothing to do with government paperwork. "I've seen plenty of altered bills of sale come through here," Sheila said, sliding the paperwork back across the counter, without stamping anything. "I'm going to need to call the seller directly before I process this registration." Marcus, genuinely confused, given that the bill of sale was signed, dated, and matched every detail of the vehicle he had actually purchased, asked what specifically about the document seemed altered or suspicious to her, since it had clearly been prepared using the state's own standard form. Sheila's expression did not soften. "The price just seems low for that model year," she said. A justification that had nothing to do with document authenticity and everything to do with an assumption about what Marcus could plausibly have paid for a truck in that condition. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, the particular frustration of watching a legitimate transaction treated as inherently suspicious because the price did not match some unstated expectation Sheila had formed about him personally, rather than about the vehicle itself. "I negotiated that price directly with the seller," he said, his voice level despite the mounting irritation. "The truck has some mechanical issues I'll be addressing myself, which is reflected in what I paid for it. Exactly the kind of detail that explains a below-market price, without requiring any suspicion whatsoever. I have his contact information if you'd like to verify it, but I'd like to understand why a routine registration requires this level of scrutiny, when every document I provided matches exactly what's required." Sheila did not have a specific answer. Only the accumulated weight of a judgment formed the moment she looked at his work clothes and decided, without asking a single respectful clarifying question, that suspicion was the appropriate response. Bryce, sensing the shift in his father's tone, even though he did not fully understand the specifics, looked up from his handheld game with the same watchful attention he brought to most uncertain situations. "Dad, is something wrong?" he asked quietly, more curious than alarmed, though the tension in the room was clearly registering with him regardless. Marcus glanced back at him, kept his voice warm, despite everything else happening. "Just some paperwork, buddy," he said. "Give me a minute." He turned back to Sheila. "I'd like you to call the seller, if that's what your process requires," he said. "But I'd also like you to explain what specifically about my documentation triggered this, since every piece of paperwork you asked for is sitting right there in front of you, complete and accurate." A man waiting a few chairs down, flipping through a folder of his own paperwork, had looked up entirely, watching the exchange with visible discomfort. An older woman near the entrance, waiting with a numbered ticket of her own, had also paused, her attention drawn by the rising tension at the counter. A third person, a younger woman standing near the forms table filling out her own registration paperwork, glanced over as well, her pen pausing mid-signature as she took in the direction the conversation had taken. Sheila, sensing the room's attention gathering, doubled down rather than reconsidering. "I have to follow protocol when something looks unusual," she said, her voice carrying a defensive edge. Marcus looked at her steadily. "Then tell me specifically what protocol you're following," he said. "Don't just decide this is unusual because of how I'm dressed and hold up a routine registration over a price you've personally decided seems too low." The man with the folder finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Sheila directly. "I've registered 3 vehicles at this counter over the years. I've never once seen anyone question this closely over a private sale price. What's actually different here?" Sheila glanced at him with visible irritation. "This isn't your transaction," she said. The man did not back down. "I'm sitting here watching you delay a straightforward registration for no reason you've actually explained," he said. "That makes it my business." The older woman near the entrance added, more quietly but no less firmly, "For what it's worth, I've seen plenty of private sale prices lower than book value come through this office. That's not unusual at all. My own nephew sold his car for half what it was worth just last year to get rid of it quickly, and nobody batted an eye." The younger woman near the forms table, still holding her pen, added her own observation, hesitant but audible. "He's got the bill of sale right there, signed and dated," she said. "That's usually all this office asks for." Sheila did not respond to any of them directly, her attention still fixed on Marcus, though the accumulating weight of a room full of witnesses openly questioning her judgment had visibly begun to erode her earlier confidence. It was at this point that another man in line, waiting several places back, stepped forward, his attention shifting from his own paperwork to Marcus's face with a growing intensity that had nothing to do with vehicle registrations. He stopped a few feet away, staring, before finally speaking. "I know you," he said slowly, his voice carrying an uncertainty that made both Marcus and Sheila turn toward him. Marcus looked at him, searching a face he did not immediately place among the many he had encountered over 10 years of service. "6 years ago," the man said, his voice steadying as recognition solidified. "The ambush outside Candelet, 2nd Platoon. I was pinned down in that irrigation ditch with 2 other guys, taking fire from 3 directions, and our own element was cut off from support for almost 40 minutes. There was a weapons sergeant who crossed open ground twice under direct fire to reposition a gun team that turned the entire engagement, and I remember thinking, watching him move through that kill zone like it was nothing, that I'd never seen anyone that controlled under that much pressure in my entire life. I still remember the exact sound the rounds made hitting the mud wall behind us, and how certain I was, for a solid 10 minutes, that none of us in that ditch were making it out. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, an old memory surfacing before he consciously reached for it. Fragments of dust and muzzle flashes, and the specific, narrow calculation required to move safely across ground that offered no cover whatsoever. I remember my squad leader saying afterward that if that gun team hadn't gotten repositioned when it did, we'd have lost at least 3 more guys before support arrived. The man continued, his voice unsteady now. I never knew your name. Different units, different chain of command, and I never had a way to track you down afterward, though I asked around for a while, back when the memory was still fresh enough that I needed to know. I've told that story to my own kids more times than I can count, about the guy who crossed that field twice, like it was nothing, and I never thought I'd actually run into you at a DMV counter, of all places, on an ordinary Friday morning that started out looking like nothing special at all. The room had gone almost completely quiet. Sheila's hand, still resting on the bill of sale, had gone still. The man with the folder had set it down entirely, watching now without any pretense of doing otherwise. The younger woman near the forms table had stopped writing altogether, her pen hovering above her half-signed paperwork. Marcus stood very still, the weight of that engagement settling back over him in a way he had not expected on an ordinary Friday morning errand. Staff Sergeant Marcus Delaney, he said quietly. Left active duty 2 years ago. That day outside Candelet, I remember it. The gun team repositioning wasn't exactly textbook, but it held, and it's one of the harder days of my career to think about, honestly. Even 6 years later, the kind of day that surfaces in dreams more often than I'd like to admit. The man crossed the remaining distance and gripped Marcus's hand with both of his, holding it a moment longer than a simple handshake required. I'm here today because of what you did in that ditch, he said, his voice rough. My whole squad is, actually. 3 of us still keep in touch. And none of that happens without those 2 crossings you made under fire that afternoon. Crossings that, looking back on it now, I still can't fully explain how anyone managed to survive. I never thought I'd get the chance to actually thank you, and I certainly never expected it would happen while you were being accused of forging paperwork for a used truck. Sheila stood behind the counter, with the particular stillness of a woman whose understanding of the last 20 minutes had just been completely restructured. She looked at Bryce, still sitting quietly with his game, at the small crowd of customers who had gathered near the counter, and something in her expression shifted from certainty into something considerably less comfortable. I'd like this registration process now, Marcus said, turning back to her, his voice still even, despite everything. And I'd like to understand why complete, accurate documentation wasn't sufficient before you decided a legitimate sale price warranted this kind of scrutiny. Sheila, visibly rattled, mentioned something about routine verification for unusually priced transactions. Marcus pointed out that private sale prices varied constantly and asked what specific threshold or policy she was actually applying, since nothing in the DMV's published guidelines mentioned price-based verification at all. And he had, in fact, reviewed those guidelines carefully before making this trip specifically to ensure he had everything required. Sheila did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one. Only the accumulated weight of a decision made the moment she looked at his work clothes and decided, without asking a single respectful question, that suspicion was the appropriate response rather than the same basic courtesy she would likely have extended without hesitation to a customer who looked less like someone she had already decided to doubt. I apologize, Sheila said finally, the words arriving stiffly, a woman unaccustomed to producing them without an audience forcing the issue. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. You should, he said. Not because of anything you just heard about who I am. Because you delayed a legitimate registration and implied I'd forged documents in front of my son before checking a single actual fact. That would have been wrong no matter who was standing at this counter. Sheila nodded slowly, and something in her expression suggested the distinction had actually registered, even if it had taken an unlikely coincidence to make it land. Sheila processed the registration within minutes, once she finally reviewed the paperwork properly, stamping and completing what should have taken 30 seconds from the very beginning. The entire delay resolved faster than it had taken her to first raise her objection at the counter. The man who had recognized Marcus stayed nearby while the transaction completed, crouching down slightly to speak with Bryce, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide, careful eyes. "Your dad's a hero. You know that," he said gently. Bryce nodded slowly, filing the words away with the seriousness he brought to most things, his handheld game entirely forgotten now. "I knew he used to be a soldier," he said. "I didn't know it was like that." The man smiled at him. "The bravest thing about your dad isn't just that day in the field," he said. "It's that he comes home and takes care of you every single day, and never once needs anybody to know the rest of it. That takes its own kind of strength, the kind most people never get to see, because it doesn't happen anywhere anybody's watching." On the drive home, new registration finally in hand, Bryce was quiet for a while, working through something in the unhurried way he worked through most things, his handheld game forgotten in his lap for once. "Dad," he said eventually, "why didn't you just tell her what you used to do right away? It would have stopped faster." Marcus glanced at him in the mirror. "Maybe," he said. "But then the lesson she'd have learned was that she was wrong to treat me that way because of what I did years ago, not because it was already wrong before she knew anything about me at all. I want you to understand the difference, because only one of those is actually true." Bryce considered this for a long moment, turning it over with the same seriousness he brought to most difficult ideas his father offered him. "So it's not about the soldier stuff," he said slowly. "It's about just treating people right because they're people." Marcus nodded. "That's exactly it," he said. Bryce nodded back, satisfied, and then asked if they could stop for burgers to celebrate finally getting the truck legally on the road, an idea Marcus found himself unable to refuse, given how the morning had actually gone. He thought about that morning often in the days that followed, not with anger, which had never been the feeling he carried longest, but with a plain, clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it meant. The DMV's regional office called him personally later that week, an apology delivered without an audience this time, along with confirmation that staff would be receiving retraining on customer treatment and unconscious bias, delivered without Marcus needing to ask for either. The regional supervisor also mentioned that 2 other customers had reached out separately in the days following the incident, describing what they had witnessed and requesting a broader review of how the office handled private sale registrations, feedback Marcus suspected had done more to prompt the retraining than his own complaint alone would have accomplished. He accepted the apology without making more of it than it was. What mattered more to him was quieter than any formal gesture. The fact that his son had watched him hold his ground calmly in a moment designed to make him feel like a criminal over a used truck, had watched a stranger recognize a truth that should never have needed recognizing in the first place, and had learned without being told directly that dignity was not something earned by revealing what he had once done. It was something owed simply for showing up as himself, complete paperwork and history both intact, asking for nothing more than the routine registration he had already earned. He thought, too, about the man from the ditch outside Condelay, about the strange coincidence of an ordinary Friday morning, containing both an unfair accusation and an overdue thank you that had been waiting 6 years for the right moment to finally arrive, and found something quietly moving in the fact that both had converged in the same 20 minutes at a DMV counter of all places, on a morning that was supposed to be about nothing more significant than a truck registration. He also thought, driving home with Bryce quietly playing his handheld game in the passenger seat, about the particular symmetry of that morning. How the same composure that had once carried him safely across open ground under fire had also carried him through an unfair accusation in a government office, and understood that whatever people assumed about him based on his work clothes, the actual measure of the man underneath had never changed, depending on who happened to be watching or what they happened to assume. Some mornings, the measure of a man is not the ground he once crossed twice under fire, but the quiet, steady patience he brings home to the one child depending on him long after the deployment's ended. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.